What would you do if a wild animal appeared at your doorstep? Alone, fragile, and cold. When a solitary woman living deep in the Rocky Mountains opened her door to find a bobcat kitten trembling on her porch, she never expected it would lead to a journey that would change both their lives. Not just a story of survival, but a story of healing, connection, and the wild ways in which the universe brings together two broken souls in need of each other. Stay with us. This isn't just about a wild animal being rescued. It's about trust and what happens when you open your heart to the unexpected. A solitary life in the Colorado wild. Some people run to the world to heal. Others run away from it, into silence, into snow, into the arms of something wild. Harper Quinn had long since stopped listening for voices in the silence. At 41, she lived alone in a small log cabin, perched along the remote edge of San Isabel National Forest, just outside of Leadville, Colorado. One of the coldest, highest towns in America. Her only neighbors were pine trees, snow hares, and the occasional elk that wandered through the clearing out front. She wasn't always this way. There had been a time when Harper's life was bright and full of motion. She was a wildlife photographer, a good one too. Her work had graced magazine covers and gallery walls. She traveled the globe, capturing the raw beauty of the wild. Lions stretching in the Serengeti dawn. Wolves sprinting through the Yukon snow. Even orcas breaching in icy Alaskan waters. But that was before the world shifted and shattered beneath her. Before a tragedy, one she never spoke of, hollowed her out and left her aching for something no city, no therapy, no camera could ever give back. Harper had retreated to the mountains nearly 4 years ago, after signing over the lease of her Denver apartment and ghosting the art world that once knew her name. Her copper-red hair had faded under a constant knit hat, and the soft freckles across her cheeks were now mostly hidden beneath a parka hood. She didn't wear makeup anymore. Her fingers, long and slender, were cracked from splitting logs. Her eyes, a pale, sea-glass green, were beautiful but guarded. She was not sad. Not anymore. Just quiet. Each day was the same, and that's how she liked it. She woke at dawn, brewed coffee in an old enamel pot, tended to the wood stove, and recorded thoughts in a leather-bound journal. The wild had become her companion. But what she didn't know, not yet, was that this winter would bring her something she never expected. Not a storm, not a danger, but a set of eyes, blue, trembling and waiting at her door. Winter's grip and quiet signs. In the stillness of the wilderness, even the smallest sound can mean something's coming, something that might change everything. Winter had settled deep into the bones of the land. The first heavy snow had fallen in early October, and by December, Harper's cabin stood surrounded by nearly 3 feet of powder. The roof creaked under its weight. The wind rattled the shutters like a child trying to get in. She didn't mind the cold. She had learned its rules. Each morning, she checked the firewood stack, now cut and split into neat rows under a canvas tarp. She shoveled the path from the cabin door to the woodshed, boots crunching across hardened snow, breath fogging the air like smoke from a candle. This was the life she'd chosen. Predictable, quiet. But lately, something felt off. She noticed it first in the mornings, faint, crescent-shaped tracks along the back porch. Not deer, not rabbit. The size was wrong, the spacing too light for a coyote. They weren't fresh every day, but frequent enough that Harper began to keep note of them in her journal. Unfamiliar tracks again. Backstep near the compost bin. Small pads, claws, maybe lynx. The thought both thrilled and worried her. She'd seen bobcats before, even once caught a shot of one peering over a ridge at dawn. But they didn't come close to homes. They didn't linger, and they didn't scratch the doorframe like something trying to get in. Still, there were no signs of aggression, no markings of territory, just quiet curiosity. By the third week of December, Harper began to hear it, faint, scratching at night, a shuffle on the porch. One night, a soft cry, almost like a kitten's mewl, carried through the frozen stillness. But when she opened the door, nothing was there. Only moonlight, pine shadows, and wind. She told herself it was her imagination, the cold playing tricks. Or maybe, just maybe, the mountain had a secret, and it was getting closer every night. The silence that had once comforted her now seemed to hold its breath. Something was watching, something was waiting, and soon it would arrive, the visitor on the porch. Sometimes the wild doesn't knock. It just arrives, cold, broken, and looking you in the eye. It happened just after sunrise. The snow had fallen thick and wet through the night, piling silently on the porch railings and turning the trees into stoic white statues. Harper stepped outside, mug of coffee in hand, expecting nothing more than the usual silence. But then she saw it. Curled against the corner of the porch, half buried in snow, was a small shape, unmoving, fragile, and quiet. She froze. At first glance, it looked like a bundle of old fur, maybe something a fox had dragged up during the night. But then it stirred, a twitch, a breath. Harper set her mug down slowly and stepped closer, her boots crunching softly on the frozen boards. It was a kitten. No, not a house cat, not even close. The fur was short and dense, a dusty gray mottled with faint spots, like snow pressed over ash. Its ears were small, black-tipped, with tufts that stood just slightly like crooked paintbrushes. Its eyes, barely open, flickered blue under crusted lashes. A bobcat, a wild one. No more than 8 weeks old, barely the size of a loaf of bread. It was injured, one leg bent at a strange angle, and a thin line of dried blood trailed from its hind flank down to the porch. Frost clung to its whiskers. The little body trembled with cold. Harper knelt slowly, heart pounding. This was not a pet, not something meant to be touched or tamed. But this little creature wasn't wild right now. It was dying. She grabbed the old wool blanket she kept by the door for firewood runs and wrapped it gently around the kitten. It didn't protest. Just let out the faintest, broken whimper. Back inside, she stoked the fire high and laid the kitten on a thick flannel pad by the hearth. She didn't know what to feed a bobcat, so she warmed some leftover chicken broth and soaked a strip of meat in it. The kitten licked, slowly, then more eagerly. Harper watched from a few feet away, her hands shaking. She should call someone, a ranger, a veterinarian. But instead she whispered to the kitten like a secret. "You're safe now. I've got you." And just like that, everything began to change. Naming the wild. Sometimes trust doesn't come in words. It comes in silence, in warmth, in the way two lost things recognize each other. Harper didn't sleep that night. She stayed curled on the floor near the fireplace, the warm orange glow painting soft shadows across the cabin walls. The bobcat kitten, still unnamed, lay bundled in a blanket, barely moving except for the shallow rise and fall of its tiny chest. She had placed a shallow bowl of water nearby, along with some shredded chicken soaked in broth. The kitten had taken a few bites, but mostly it just slept. Its right hind leg was clearly injured, swollen, and stiff, likely sprained or fractured. Harper kept her movements slow, her voice even softer. No sudden gestures, no loud sounds. She'd dealt with wildlife before, back when she was photographing grizzlies in British Columbia or tracking cougars in the Sierra Nevadas. But this was different. This wasn't a subject behind a lens. This was in her home, in her care. By morning, the kitten stirred. Its eyes opened fully, for the first time. Icy blue, piercing, and alert despite the exhaustion. It didn't hiss or growl, just stared. That stare held something Harper hadn't seen in years. Recognition. Maybe not of her, but of something deeper. Like the bobcat, knew what it meant to be broken, lost, and alone. She sat cross-legged on the floor, a few feet away, notebook in hand. "You need a name," she murmured. She flipped a page and began writing. Not Fluffy, or Shadow, or anything cute. That wasn't who this creature was. "Ash," she whispered. It fit. The color of his coat, the quiet way he moved, the fact that he had come from the cold like something burned and forgotten. "Ash," she said again. The kitten blinked slowly. His ears twitched. And then, almost impossibly, he let out a small, warbling sound. Not a meow, not a growl. Something between the two. She smiled for the first time in weeks. "You'll stay for now," she said gently, voice barely above the fire's crackle. "Just until you're strong enough." But even as she said it, Harper felt something stir in her chest. Something she thought she'd buried deep under snow and silence. Hope. A fragile beginning. Healing doesn't always roar. Sometimes it curls up beside a fire and simply breathes. Over the next few days, Harper watched Ash with a quiet attentiveness she hadn't realized she still possessed. He stayed close to the fireplace, rarely venturing more than a few feet from the warmth. The swelling in his leg had gone down slightly, though he still limped when he moved. Harper fashioned a soft splint out of a thick wool sock and a pair of wooden tongue depressors she found in the back of a drawer. To her surprise, Ash tolerated it. She expected hissing, biting, feral instinct, but he only looked at her with those silent, frost-colored eyes. She began documenting his behavior, the way she used to in her field journals. Day 3. Ate a full portion, still limping, no growling. Follows me with his eyes. Day 4. Groomed his front paw. Let me get within 1 foot. No signs of distress. Day 5. Took a nap within arm's reach. Ash was beginning to adapt, and Harper. So was she. She spoke to him often, not in baby talk, but in the slow, deliberate tone she used with wild things. She told him stories of her travels, of the time she'd waited 9 hours in a glacier cave to photograph a snow leopard. She told him about her ex-husband, about how they used to plan hikes that never happened. And once, after 2 cups of whiskey and a night full of stars, she told him about her son. Not the whole story, not yet, but just his name, Lucas. Ash, curled by the fire, hadn't moved, but she swore his ears turned at the sound. In the daylight, Harper let the kitten roam the cabin, slowly, cautiously. He explored with calculated movements, sniffing at shelves, pawing at the edges of rugs, and eventually leaping, clumsily, onto the window ledge to watch the snow drift past the glass. She left the front door slightly ajar during the afternoons in case he wanted to go. But he didn't. Not yet. Instead, he began following her from room to room, his small pads making no sound on the wooden floors. He'd settle near her feet when she painted or journaled. And once, when she fell asleep in the armchair by the fire, she awoke to find him curled beneath her legs, breathing slow and steady. The silence in the cabin no longer felt empty. It felt shared, the spark of trust. The wild doesn't surrender easily, but when it does, it gives you everything it has left. On the 7th day, something shifted. Harper had just returned from chopping wood, her arms sore and her breath forming little clouds in the frozen morning air. She stomped her boots clean and stepped into the warm hush of the cabin. Ash was there, perched like a shadow on the windowsill, his eyes following her every move. She peeled off her gloves, hung her coat, and glanced at him. "Watching me again," she said softly, brushing snow from her sleeves. He blinked once, slow. calm. She walked to the stove, filled the kettle, and turned toward him again. "You hungry?" As if on cue, Ash leapt from the window to the floor, still stiff on the injured leg, but moving easier now. He padded over to the kitchen table where she'd placed a shallow dish of warmed chicken and rice. He didn't wait for her to leave the room this time. He began to eat with small, delicate bites, while Harper sat at the table, notebook in hand, quietly jotting down the moment. Trust. Real trust. It was starting to show. Later that afternoon, as she painted by the fireplace, Ash curled up by her feet, not near the edge of the room like before, but close, brushing against her boot with his fur. She felt it. That quiet offering of presence. She didn't dare move, not yet, so she just kept painting. A blurry silhouette of a bobcat on a porch, snow swirling around it like ghosts. That night, the wind howled through the trees outside, shaking the windows. A bitter front was rolling in. Harper added another log to the fire, wrapped a blanket around herself, and sat in her old rocking chair with a book she hadn't opened in months. Ash approached slowly, carefully. He stopped just in front of her knees. Then, without a sound, he lifted his front paws and pulled himself into her lap. Her heart nearly stopped. He was heavier than he looked, warm and soft and trembling ever so slightly. He curled into a ball and tucked his nose beneath her arm. Harper didn't move, didn't breathe, didn't dare disturb the miracle that had just happened. And in that quiet, flickering moment, she realized something. They weren't healing separately anymore. They were healing together. The storm that tested them. It's easy to trust when the sky is clear, but when the storm comes, that's when you learn who truly stays. The storm arrived without warning. Late January in the Rockies was always brutal, but this one came with a vengeance. Like the mountain had decided it was done playing nice. It started with wind, not a breeze, not a howl, but a roar. Trees groaned. Snowdrifts shifted and collapsed. The cabin windows rattled in their frames like bones begging to hold. Then came the whiteout, blinding sheets of snow that swallowed the forest whole. By sunset, the porch had vanished beneath a wall of ice, and the satellite phone flickered and died. Harper checked the food. Enough for 2 weeks if they rationed. Firewood? Stacked high, thank God. Water? She filled every pot and jug in the house just in case the pipes froze. Ash, now stronger and more agile, sensed the change too. He paced near the windows, his paws light but restless. He kept sniffing at the door, glancing back at Harper with something in his eyes that looked like unease. "It's all right," she told him, her voice calm despite the growing tension. "We've got everything we need." But the wind didn't let up. On the second night, a tree branch crashed against the roof, and Harper shot upright in bed, heart pounding. She ran her fingers along the ceiling beam. No crack, just sound, just noise. Ash was already at the window, growling low in his throat, a sound she hadn't heard from him before. A warning. "Easy," she whispered, kneeling beside him. "It's just the wind." But it wasn't. Not entirely. The next morning brought tracks around the cabin. Not Ash's, not rabbit or deer. Larger, deeper, circling. A mountain lion. She'd seen the signs before. Territorial sweeps, silent stalking, looking for prey too weak to run. And Ash, with his still healing leg, was a target. Harper bolted the doors, stacked firewood high by the windows, and moved Ash's bedding to the far corner of the cabin, away from any glass. Her heart thudded with a cold she hadn't felt in years. Not the chill outside, but the old ache of fear creeping back in. She had thought the storm was the threat. She was wrong. The real danger was still out there, and it was watching. The eyes in the dark. When fear presses against the walls, courage doesn't always roar. It stands quietly between what you love and what wants to harm it. That night, Harper didn't sleep. The cabin creaked with the weight of wind and snow, but it was the silence between gusts that chilled her most. Outside, the world was a white abyss, moonless and soundless. But somewhere in that stillness, danger crouched. She kept the rifle close, though she hadn't fired a gun in years. It leaned by the door, oiled and loaded. A precaution, she told herself, just in case. Ash refused to settle. He paced from window to door and back again, tail low, body tight. Once, he let out a low yowl that echoed through the cabin like a ghost's warning. Harper tried to soothe him, but his instincts were louder than her voice. Then, just past 2 a.m., it came. A growl. Deep, low, close. Harper jerked awake from the shallow doze she'd fallen into beside the fire. Ash was frozen at the window, ears flat, eyes locked on something just outside the glass. She grabbed the flashlight and crept toward the window. Outside, barely visible through the frost-lined pane, was a shape. Large, still, watching. The mountain lion stood at the edge of the porch, its tawny body barely visible against the storm-slicked snow. Muscles rippled beneath its coat. Its golden eyes locked with Harper's. No fear, no hesitation. Predator. And then it took a step forward. Harper's breath caught. She reached slowly for the rifle, but before she could lift it, a flash of movement darted past her legs. Ash! The Bobcat Kitten, no longer fragile, no longer unsure, launched himself at the window, slamming his small body against the glass and unleashing a fierce, guttural screech. His back arched, his ears pinned. He was wild in that moment, every inch of him feral fire. The mountain lion froze. And then, as suddenly as it had appeared, it turned and vanished into the snow. Harper stood in stunned silence, her hands trembling. Ash padded back slowly, the tip of his tail flicking. She dropped to her knees and pulled him into her arms. "You brave little fool," she whispered into his fur. "You saved us." Outside, the storm began to ease. Inside, the fire still burned. But the bond between them, raw, real, had turned into something unshakable, the quiet between storms. When the snow finally stopped falling, something else started to grow, something neither of them had dared to believe in again. The morning after the lion vanished, Harper stepped outside for the first time in 2 days. The sky was a pale, icy blue, and the trees glittered under a fresh layer of snow. The storm had passed, but the silence it left behind felt sacred. Ash followed close behind her, his steps light in the snow. His injured leg was improving, still stiff, but stronger now. He no longer limped as he once had. Harper turned back toward the cabin, her breath curling in the air. It looked smaller now, warmer, not just shelter, but a home. She knelt and pressed her palm into the snow beside Ash's paw prints. Tiny indentations, soon to vanish with the day's sun, yet so powerful in their meaning. "You belong here," she whispered, mostly to herself. Back inside, routines returned. They shared breakfast. Her with oatmeal and strong coffee, Ash with warm chicken and soft scrambled eggs. She set her journal beside the window and began to write again. But not just about the bobcat. Now she wrote about dreams, small and quiet. About the idea of spring. About rebuilding. Ash had taken to following her closely, not with the fearful watchfulness of before, but with calm curiosity. He'd leap to her desk while she painted, curl by her feet when she read, and sometimes even paw gently at her hand when he wanted her attention. One afternoon, Harper pulled out her old camera for the first time in years. She hadn't touched it since her son's accident. The lens had gathered dust. Her fingers hesitated over the shutter, unsure, but Ash had settled by the window again, the golden light catching the fine edges of his ear tufts. Without thinking, she raised the camera. Click. The sound was like unlocking a door inside her. She took another. And another. Not for a gallery. Not for fame. Just for the moment. Ash turned to look at her, ears alert, eyes bright. As if he knew. Later that evening, as they sat together by the fire, Harper looked down at the sleeping bobcat, curled against her side. "You didn't just survive," she murmured. "You reminded me how to live." Ash's tail flicked once in response, and for the first time in years, Harper felt something shift deep inside her. Peace. And the beginning of something more. A name spoken to the wind. You think you're saving them, but sometimes it's you who's been rescued all along. The days that followed moved slower, softer. Ash now greeted each morning perched on the windowsill, watching the horizon as if waiting for something to appear from the tree line. Harper would wake to find him sitting in silence, his fur kissed gold by the rising sun, his breath fogging the glass. There was a stillness to him now, a knowing. Spring was still weeks away, but hints of it crept into the cabin's rhythm. The snow fell less often. The wind softened. Birds began returning, one or two at a time, their calls tentative as if unsure the storm had truly passed. Ash's healing accelerated. He climbed more now, onto shelves, countertops, her bed. He seemed drawn to the highest corners of the cabin, surveying everything like a prince returned to his kingdom. Harper laughed more. She hadn't realized how long it had been since laughter had lived in her throat without bitterness. One evening, she brought out a photo album. Not a digital one, but an old, leather-bound book with pages that smelled of cedar and ink. She hadn't opened it in years. Ash sat beside her, his ears flicking as she turned each page. There were pictures of places she'd been, the Amazon, Patagonia, the Yukon. And then Lucas, his tiny face, grinning beside a riverbank. A boy, bundled in scarves, holding a camera almost too big for his hands. The last photo was the hardest. Lucas and Harper standing on a mountain trail, wind in their hair, light in their eyes. She didn't cry, not this time. Instead, she looked down at Ash and whispered, "He would have loved you." Ash blinked slowly, then pressed his head against her arm. She felt the warmth of him, solid and alive. And in that moment, she made a silent promise. When spring came, when the world softened again, she would open the cabin door and let him choose. To stay, to go, to find the rest of whatever wild called to him. But no matter what he chose, she would not shut down again. The world had broken her once, but Ash had stitched her back together, with nothing more than presence, patience, and instinct. Sometimes the wild doesn't come to be tamed. It comes to remind you how to feel again. And Harper was finally ready, when the wild calls again. The hardest part of love is knowing when to let go, and choosing to anyway. By early March, the snow began to retreat in thin, glittering sheets. Tiny rivulets of meltwater trickled along the cabin's roof, dripping steadily into the soil below. The pines shook free their heavy coats, and green buds whispered promises from beneath the thawing earth. Ash felt it. Harper saw it in the way he moved, quicker, leaner, more restless. He no longer curled by the fire all day or sat lazily at her side. Instead, he lingered near the door. He stared out the window longer than before. His ears twitched at distant sounds. Something deep inside him was waking up. Instinct, freedom, wildness. Harper knew it couldn't be stopped. It wasn't fear or distance that pulled him toward the trees. It was his nature. And if she truly loved him, she would have to honor that. So, she began preparing him, not just emotionally but physically. She weaned him off soft foods, slowly introducing raw cuts and bones to strengthen his bite. She laid down fur pelts outside the cabin to reintroduce the scent of prey. She opened the door wider each morning, letting him choose the time he spent out. At first, Ash hesitated. He would step just past the porch, sniff the air, and glance back at her. She never called to him, never begged. She just watched, waited. One day, he didn't glance back. Instead, he padded off into the trees and didn't return until nightfall. She left the door unlatched that evening. By then, the cabin had grown quiet again. But it was a different quiet, not hollow, not aching. A quiet that knew it had once been filled, and that fullness still echoed in every beam, every floorboard. The next morning, Harper woke alone. Ash was gone, and this time, it didn't feel like loss. It felt like love, walking away into the wild. Footprints in the frost. Some stories don't end with goodbyes. They end with a door left open, and the memory of something wild that chose you for a while. Harper stood at the edge of the clearing, boots buried ankle-deep in slush, as dawn broke across the treetops. The forest was alive again, no longer hushed by winter, but murmuring with the sounds of things awakening. She clutched the worn wool blanket in her arms, the one Ash had curled into when he first arrived. It still held a few strands of his fur, soft and pale like smoke. Beneath her feet, the snow was melting fast, revealing old pine needles and dark, damp soil. And there, just past the edge of the porch, were tracks, fresh ones, small, round and sure-footed, heading east. Not hurried, not afraid. Harper knelt beside them and touched the closest print with her fingers. She didn't cry. She didn't call his name. Instead, she spread the blanket on a flat rock near the edge of the woods and placed a piece of cooked meat in the center. A gift. A reminder. And then she whispered, "You'll always have a home here." Back inside, she sat by the window with a mug of tea, watching the forest breathe. The cabin felt different now, not just a refuge, but a place that had witnessed something extraordinary. Ash had not been a pet. He had been a turning point, a living, breathing moment of grace that walked out of the woods and reminded her that life still pulsed in her chest. Weeks passed. The days lengthened. The cold softened. And though Harper sometimes found herself watching the trees, hoping for a flicker of movement, she never chased it. She had learned what real connection meant. Not possession, not control, but presence and the courage to let it leave. Ash was gone, but his spirit lingered in every rustle of the underbrush, every creak of the wood, every flicker of firelight. Some bonds don't break. They just walk into the wild and carry you with them. The return of the wild. When the wild gives you its trust once, it's a miracle. When it returns to you, it's something more. 1 year later, the mountain was blooming. It was early April in Colorado, and the trees were alive with green again. Snowmelt trickled down from the ridgelines, feeding the swollen streams, and wildflowers pushed up through the damp soil like little beacons of rebirth. Harper had changed too. She no longer flinched at memories. She no longer lived in silence. The cabin had evolved into a place of purpose. Books stacked neatly by the window, paintings half finished on easels, a trail camera mounted to a pine just beyond the porch. Harper had begun volunteering with a nearby wildlife rehabilitation center once a week, hiking 5 miles down the trail, and another 2 by truck to reach their outpost in Buena Vista. She shared Ash's story there, never with sensationalism, only with reverence. The volunteers called it a once-in-a-lifetime bond, but she always smiled and said, "He was just passing through." That morning was cool and bright, the air full of birdsong. Harper brewed her coffee and stepped outside, same as always, letting the warmth of the mug seep into her fingers. The sun filtered through the pines, casting dappled light across the frost-softened earth. Then she heard it. A soft scratch, Barely audible, she turned slowly, and there he was. Standing at the edge of the clearing, framed by sunlight and shadow, was a full-grown bobcat. Ash. Bigger now, stronger. His coat was thick and healthy, those same faint spots still visible beneath the tan and gray. But it was the eyes that told her. Blue, ice clear, watchful. He stepped forward, but Harper stayed still, heart racing. Then, behind him, came another shape, smaller, quieter. A kitten, Ash's kitten. The tiny creature darted around his legs, paws clumsy in the soft ground. Ash gently nudged it forward with his nose. The little one paused, then padded up to the cabin's edge and sat, just like he once had, curled up and waiting. Harper knelt, not too close, and whispered, "You brought them home." Ash didn't move toward her, but he didn't leave either. He watched as the kitten explored the porch, sniffing the air, nudging at the blanket she'd left last year, still there, still whole. For a long time they existed in that space together, wild and woman, past and present. Harper didn't ask for more. She didn't try to touch him. Instead, she sat cross-legged in the grass and simply watched. "I never needed you to stay," she said softly. "I just needed to know you were okay." The wind stirred the trees gently. Ash blinked once, then turned. The kitten followed. And just like that, they slipped back into the forest. Not gone, just home. Later that evening, Harper placed a new blanket on the porch and scattered fresh meat beside it. She didn't know if they'd return. That wasn't the point. The point was, they had come back. Not because they had to, but because they chose to. And that made all the difference. In life, healing doesn't always come wrapped in comfort. It often arrives unannounced, wild and untamed, asking us to open a door we'd long since locked. Harper's story reminds us that sometimes the most powerful connections happen when we let go of control and choose trust instead. Whether it's a broken animal, a broken past, or a broken heart, healing begins when we choose presence over fear and compassion over distance. Ash wasn't just a wild creature in need of saving. He became a mirror, a symbol of resilience, and the proof that love doesn't need to be owned to be real. At Paw Prints and Stories, we believe that every animal encounter leaves a mark, not just in the snow, but in the soul. So here's your challenge. What wildness in your life have you turned away from? What small, unexpected moment might be asking you to open your door again? We invite you to subscribe and walk with us through more stories that connect the human heart to the animal spirit. Because sometimes those paw prints lead us back to who we were always meant to be.